What if I just messed up the whole song? Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Dylan Love. I'm the head of news for Cointelegraph.com. We cover blockchain and cryptocurrency news on a daily basis. But before I was ever into crypto, I went deep on music. You can tell because my piano has lots of buttons. Music, quite like crypto itself, isn't going away, isn't going to disappear anytime soon. And we're seeing crypto methodologies change a little bit of everything these days. So the question we want to unpack here for this edition of Cointelegraph Talks is, what implications does blockchain hold for the music industry? In 2020, it's just getting increasingly difficult for musical artists to navigate their promotion, distribution, and getting paid. And that's all only after they've done the work of recording and performing their music. Each of the guests on today's show runs a blockchain company that stands to change a little bit of everything for working musicians today. So we are very pleased to welcome Daniel Dewar, the founder and CEO of Paperchain, a payment gateway for content creators. Jesse Grushack is co-founder of Ujo Music, is a zero-fee blockchain-based platform that lets music creators keep 100% of their profits. And we've also got Roneil Rumburg, who's co-founder and CEO of the blockchain-based censorship-resistant streaming platform Audius. Each of our guests will present individually about their company and ideas. And after they've all spoken, we'll invite them to discuss amongst themselves, maybe find some good clashes and agreements. And then after that, we'll open it up for audience questions. So please do make yourselves heard in the chat. Drop questions. We'll have somebody watching that, saving the good questions for the end. Don't ask the bad questions, just the good ones. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Let's get started with Daniel. Daniel, please tell us about yourself and Paperchain.
Thanks, Dylan. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. Before I start, I'd just like to start with an acknowledgement of country, which is, in Australia, something you do at public events such as this, because when you do go into someone else's country, it's always polite to acknowledge that. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past and present, as well as emerging elders in those communities. So Dylan mentioned I'm the founder of Paperchain, and simply we just refer to Paperchain as the fastest and easiest way for creators and media companies to get paid. So we connect to the digital reporting feeds of most of the major streaming platforms, whether it's Spotify, Apple, YouTube. So for artists or creators that are using those services, or even record labels, they can connect to their data feeds. We track all of their data, we price all of their revenue, and then we pay out that revenue on demand. So one of the biggest challenges that exists within the music industry, particularly in the trends that we've seen over the past 20 years, was this huge shift in the way consumption works, where you can now stream anything on demand. And so you have all these microtransactions that are generating large volumes of revenue every single day. But the revenue and the payments model didn't change. So our behaviors around consumption and even around distribution and the pace at which we can release content now is happening at a blinding speed. But again, the revenue and payments didn't actually innovate at the same pace. So you still have record labels waiting 3 months to get paid. You still have artists getting paid 6 or 9 months. They're getting paid once or twice a year. But the data that makes up all of these revenue models, it all exists in near real time or every day. You can get this data from Spotify. You can get it from YouTube. So we said about, well, how do we take that data and turn it into something that could be a financial instrument or a financial asset? So really the end result for a user is just the ability to get paid. You can see your revenue on Spotify from yesterday. If you want, you can get paid today. What happens in the background is we actually take that data, turn that into like a digital asset or synthetic receivable, and we can connect that into decentralized finance ecosystems. So currently, we're working through a series of betas with the MakerDAO protocol, and actually we are through the first rounds of approvals to be introduced as one of the first real-world assets into MakerDAO. So effectively, our streaming revenues our pricing streams can be fed into the MakerDAO ecosystem, and on demand, creators can actually borrow DAI based on the data they're receiving from the streaming companies. And so I think, Dylan, one thing you mentioned as a blockchain company is we typically don't refer ourselves as a blockchain company. We're just a payments company. We're solving this problem, but we just leverage the technology in an interesting way that can help us achieve those goals. I'm sure Roneil and Jesse will speak to some of the journeys we went on, but we started out going with a peer-to-peer tokenized system, and we just found that the education gap was still large enough that we felt we had to abstract away a lot of that a lot of those elements to try and get more people on board. And that's been somewhat successful, but there's still a big learning curve there. I'm sure, again, Roneil and Jesse can speak to their respective experiences. It's been, I'd say, a long process. We were founded in 2017, went through the Textiles Blockchain Accelerator in 2019. As much as the industry innovates and the technology innovates, the business side of things, it does take a very long time. But we have good track record now. So far, we've originated nearly $160,000 in advances paid to record labels and artists. And now we're tracking over $1 million of monthly streaming revenue as well. So we continue to grow, and we're seeing healthy growth, and there's starting to be a lot more activity in this space because it's a problem that persists. And so it's been an interesting journey seeing that a lot of the ideas that we've been talking about over the past 3, 4, even 5 years are starting to become a lot more prominent as the industry becomes more aware, and artists are starting to look for alternatives to the traditional payment and business structures of the industry.
Very good. Jesse, why don't you give us the download on what you're up to, man? Uh-oh, I think there's an audio issue, man. Did we lose your audio?
Nope, just muted.
There.
Yeah, I'm Jesse Grushack. I co-founded Ujo Music back in 2015. I've been in the blockchain space for about 10 years, professionally for about 5. Ujo, we set out with it, just looking at when we started the project, Ethereum hadn't even launched yet. It was super early. So we started looking at, how does music and blockchain make sense? What does that look like? How do we start to automate the money, the payments, the data through the system? Because, the systems are still using mainframes and codes that are, proprietary to different systems. And we saw it as an opportunity to kind of, break the wheel in a way. Rather naively, I would say. We went out and launched Imogen Heap's single on the blockchain in 2015, being the first non-payment related application on Ethereum. We then took our kind of knowledge and our little learnings from that, and we're like, oh, this is super cool. We can automate splits. We can automate royalties. Doesn't everyone want this? And I came from a live events background in the music industry, not from the royalty side, and got absolutely schooled in 2016 about how the music industry doesn't really care, or they didn't at the time. They didn't care about automating it. They didn't care about making it more efficient, because a lot of those inefficiencies is where they made their money. So we took a step back. We were trying to figure out what to do next, how to release this, how to solve a problem, even though we had the technology. 2017, Andre Anjos, better known as RAC, reached out to us, and he's like, "Yeah, I really want to sell my music on Ethereum. Can you guys help?" And we kind of pivoted our model a little bit, because I think we were looking at it from a much more macro perspective of how can we basically fix everything versus just actually solving a problem. And so we took his album, we released it on Ethereum, we released it with an NFT, non-fungible token, which was probably one of the first people to do that as well. So, I think a lot of what I learned with Ujo is timing is everything. We were super early to it in a lot of respects. The platform's still up, you can still sell your music, but obviously that's kind of an antiquated idea at this point. I think Audius really took what we had kind of paved the way for and ran with it with what they did with streaming. And the current status of Ujo, it is currently on hold. We're still, it's not, I won't call it dead yet, totally, but it's on hold. And we're just kind of looking around and seeing if there's any more opportunities. But, excited about what these guys are doing, because they're constantly, pushing it forward with whether it's the financial side with Paperchain and taking that and kind of cutting the money out of the system, which is huge, or the streaming, which is, how most people consume music every day. So I'm just excited to hang out with these guys and you, Dylan, and happy to be here.
Very good, man. Very good. Well, you mentioned Audius, and we happen to have somebody from Audius with us today. Roneil, why don't you give us an introduction, man?
Yeah, Dylan, thanks for having me and for organizing all of this. So I'm Roneil Rumburg. I'm one of the co-founders of Audius, and in line with what Daniel started out with, I think it is important to pay respect to the elders that preceded us here. And I think what's really interesting when you talk to anyone who's working in this little scene that we are, I think all of us have broken off like pieces of what Ujo tried to take on, and ultimately like focused on some of those pieces, right? Like the early work that Ujo did around trying to automate royalty payments, I imagine like influenced a lot of what Paperchain is doing. And similarly for us at Audius, I think the early work there around, kind of coordinating and organizing streaming and even like payments for streaming via the integration they had with this tool called Connects, was very influential in our thinking around this. So yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of we all stand on the shoulders of giants. We're all here doing our like little piece of the thing. But so just to introduce Audius quickly, we're a music streaming service that connects fans directly with artists and exclusive new content. And that direct connection is the really key thing to call out there. So the way that we enable that is by being fully decentralized. Audius is operated by a community of artists, listeners, and node operators that effectively have come together to provide this thing. Our role in it as Audius Inc., the company that exists to help steward this protocol, is to produce and ship the initial open source implementations of these node softwares, as well as the end user client that can connect to this network. But ultimately, we don't run any kind of infrastructure core to the network, right? All the content metadata, indexing of that metadata, et cetera, is being done by these community operated nodes. So today we see we've had over, I think, 85,000 tracks last I checked uploaded to Audius, and we serve about 250,000 folks every month coming on to listen to music and hang out. And just excited to be here. I think what you'll see is we all are kind of working on the same problem, but from like somewhat different directions. And I think what I'm most excited about for what blockchains can bring to music is transparency and accountability throughout the tool chain for who is getting paid what, when, how that money came to be, how users and fans are discovering the content that's there, and then ultimately using that data to our advantage to kind of like tighten these payment flows and make them happen much more quickly, but also in a much more fair manner, right? When you can now audit, the sort of the actual like total amounts of money flowing through the system and how they're getting split up.
Very good. I want to start by an open question for everybody here. What is the duty of blockchain in the music industry? Is it about tearing it down and starting over with a new blockchain-based paradigm, or is it about finding blockchain solutions that work with legacy stuff? So open question for anybody, please jump on it.
I think each of our projects speak to, I guess, a different focus or a different track to that, or an application of what you just mentioned. In our case, we are looking to how do we apply this to legacy systems that exist. Ultimately, this initial business for us is built around this convoluted supply chain or financial chain that exists between going from a streaming platform all the way down to the artists. We do recognize that over time that chain will flatten. And so there is probably a role where distributed ledger technologies or blockchain could play in that. But initially it's about, okay, there's this existing infrastructure that exists between Spotify's and distributors and labels and artists. So where does it plug in, and how does it make sense where it can introduce the least amount of friction? At least that's been our approach, because even though, yes, our thinking was, yes, we could try and build something new, but the challenge is that you have to attract subscribers or listeners. And it's very difficult to do that if you don't have catalog or get artists on board. And then at the same time, if you're an artist, it's very hard to attract artists if you don't have subscribers. So it's kind of like it was a difficult two-sided marketplace to put together that we didn't want to take on that. We didn't want to take on that headache. And Jesse and Roneil have both taken on that headache. So fair game to them. But it's something that we wanted to make our lives a little easier and avoid that. So it's just, okay, here's the existing infrastructure. We can plug in at these points here where data connects, or we can receive data. We can then, in the back end, we can do all these interesting things with DeFi protocols, and then we can just make a payment in USD or into whatever currency that our customers are using, so they don't actually end up feeling it. However, in that, what we're experiencing is there's still that on and off ramp into the crypto world. It's still a huge headache, and it's still very costly. So in the example with, like, say, MakerDAO, we can take streaming data and we can collateralize that and push that into the system, and we can draw on DAI, and then we have 60,000 DAI sitting in our wallet, and we can do that in a number of minutes. But then to get that DAI into USD and pay it into our customer's account, that still takes almost a week. So there's still that friction there, and now working through the teething problems of how do we solve that problem, because it's not only a time problem, it's also costly in terms of the cost of doing wires and things like that. So I think that time is coming closer when the idea of artists and labels working from digital wallets is going to have to come much sooner than later, because it's becoming very cost inefficient, not only for the technology providers, but also for the receivers of that as well, and their ability to access the funds. So I think, our way is eventually leading us back to a very crypto native solution, even though we started at this point of where we can adapt into legacy systems.
Mm-hmm. So what about adopting the crypto first solution from the outset? I feel like that's something Roneil can speak to, no?
Yeah, so I think we at Audius, we took kind of a very different tack on this. I think, well, I guess to level set first, like the way we use blockchains within Audius, I didn't touch on that, is that so we use two blockchains, Ethereum and this thing called POA network, and we basically use those respectively as sources of truth around given data within the system. On POA network, it's like what content was uploaded by whom, when, and who has control over modifying that content or changing it, or those kinds of things. On the Ethereum side, we use that to coordinate all of this off-chain infrastructure that people are running, right? So that's what enables kind of like random individuals to be running hosting services and indexing services and these kinds of things, but to be able to coordinate all of that in a way that doesn't require like trust in terms of knowing who is running those things necessarily, right? So I think I guess like I see really at its core what blockchains do are solve trust problems among larger groups of people than you could otherwise form trust with. Everything from Bitcoin kind of like allowing people to pay one another without trusting each other, to Audius, where we can now have like tens to hundreds of thousands of people come together and collaborate on this thing that ultimately like none of them specifically control. And I guess our take on the problem specific to the music industry is that we really saw with the state of the tech available around distributed file systems and distributed ledgers or blockchains effectively, was to create this kind of community owned and community operated streaming primitive and streaming mechanism that solved for a lot of the kind of trust or mistrust issues that exist in the music system. So obviously we're biased in how we come at this, but Dylan, to your question, I think there's always a debate between in some cases trying to work with the system that you have and make it better, and in other cases like trying to create something from scratch that can potentially solve systemic issues, but then also you're taking on like a much bigger thing potentially, and there are other issues that come with that too, right? I think it's important to pay respect to what's come and understand why we got to where we were today, rather than naively just say, oh well, what we have today is like kind of broken, so let's just start over, right? So I think we came to the conclusion that just given the sort of Byzantine nature of how money flows through the existing music kind of streaming tool chain and streaming economy more generally, as well as just the the convoluted nature of like how everything fits together. starting over from somewhat of a clean slate that was a little bit more transparent and accountable from day one, we felt was really the only way to go after this. And I guess the way we tried to structure ourselves as a project and as a movement is to say that, like, you shouldn't have to trust our company around this either, right? Like, the only thing that you should have to trust when working with this system is, the way that the system is implemented on chain and on the nodes that these folks are operating, right? And their sort of trust minimization mechanisms around that. We felt is really important for, like, artists and creators and rights holders too, right? To be able to own their own means of distribution rather than relying on this kind of like convoluted mess of stuff that's, in a lot of cases, like the result of, regulation that was created before even radio existed, right? And it's just, yeah. So, yeah, I think, yeah, obviously we do have a strong take and opinion on this, but I think it's, I think there are a lot of approaches that are valid, and that's kind of the neat thing here in this conversation, right? Is that none of us really like compete with one another, even though we're trying to solve basically the same thing, right? In essence. So yeah.
Very good. You talked a little bit about how money moves through these existing business structures. I want to ask a question specifically of Jesse. Jesse, who in your experience, maybe it's a business or certain individuals, who's afraid of this stuff? Who doesn't want to touch blockchain in the music business? I'm imagining it might be big music publishers, but please tell me what that question stirs up for you.
Yeah, I think there's probably a really good example with that specifically. It was, we were sitting in a distributor's office, a pretty major one at this point. And we were just kind of asking questions and trying to get a lay of the land to try to understand where some of their pain points were. And we kind of got to the point around, like knowing who to pay, right? And that being a pretty major issue in the music industry. And they totally acknowledged it. They were like, yeah, we get checks every day, $20, $5, $100, $300. Don't know who they're for, don't know where they're supposed to go. And it's just not worth our time to figure it out. Because, the 20, 50, whatever, $100 an hour you're paying the person to figure out where that goes, you're not getting paid for that, right? You're doing a nice service. But on the flip side, they take all those checks, they put them into an account, and if someone comes over the next, I think, 2 years, they are happy to give it to them. But after that 2 years, it's theirs, and they don't care. So it's that little black box that can be pretty profitable, but it's that black box that for musicians that, that's dinner tomorrow night. That's, your rent check. It's, whatever it is, and it's not getting to the right people. And so, the music industry, a lot of it, those inefficiencies are where they make their money. And I think, to the point earlier of starting with blockchain and or music, and we started totally blockchain, totally decentralized. I think there was someone put out a guide. They were like, how is this a better solution when it takes one step to click $10 on iTunes and 17 steps to click, buy album on Ujo. So, I commend these guys for both hiding the blockchain aspect of it, because we're not there yet. We're not at that super easy, frictionless standpoint yet, where everyone's got a MetaMask installed.
Yeah, just a couple of bits on the transparency piece. Like, one of the things, I guess, about building from you, and for people who don't know, streaming revenue isn't priced. So, like, if you generate your streams on Spotify, you don't actually know what that's worth for yesterday or even for the start of the month, because it's a floating payout rate. It changes month on month based on a number of factors, like, territories, like where the stream was generated, whether the listener was on a subscription or whether they were listening to an ad revenue or whether they were bundled as part of some other deal, how much, your overall streams contributed to the overall market share. So what was your market share of the total listeners on the platform? It's not until so we're in August now. It's not until September 15 or September 20 that Spotify will issue a statement saying, well, you generated this many streams, but here's how much those were actually worth. So you're already, if you go from the 1st of August, you're already almost 2 months behind or 60 days behind knowing what that was actually worth. And so for us, like one of the biggest challenges was actually being able to price streams in a much faster way. So the first thing we had to build was a pricing algorithm that could take historical data and be able to predict what streaming rates would be on any given day or month. And that's ultimately how we can do what we do, is we then predict what the payout rate will be, and then we can predict what the revenue will be. And we're pretty accurate with that now. We can be within 2 or 3% of the actual. But that actually allows us to do what we do, but it took a long time to get there. It took a lot of data to get there. For, in Ujo's or Audius's case, by building from the ground up, they can actually have transparent royalty rates where there can be fixed rates, and it can solve at least some of that puzzle of a lack of transparency on what are my streams actually worth, because you don't actually know that in the legacy systems. Our own experiences on things like black box royalties is, again, for those in the audience that don't know, there's actually two different types of revenues in the music industry, or royalties. There's one for publishing, which is if you're a songwriter, and there's one for recording, which is if you're the artist. And one song may have 10 different compositions, composers associated with that, and 10 different royalty structures, and then that may be recorded by one artist who has a different royalty. So it becomes quite convoluted in terms of who to pay, and definitely had those similar discussions that Jesse's had, where it's just like, we get money, we don't know who it's for, so it goes into these black boxes. I think a few years ago we tried to quantify that, and I think globally it was like 1.5 billion, and I think there's other estimates that put it at $3 or $4 billion just sitting in these accounts, and they don't know who to pay because of this traditional system of trying to identify who actually owns which composition or which royalty it gets paid to. So it becomes a compounding effect where it impacts songwriters and artists, and that's why I guess it's been a long sought after solution to this, and the industry has tried a couple of times over the past decades to solve it, but it becomes a political problem as well. So we're kind of in this position where we are, where there's a lot of companies trying to solve it as we are, but then there's this embedded or at least the current incentives to try and solve it doesn't make it as urgent for, at least when you talked about the major labels or the major publishers, the incentive to solve this problem isn't as felt urgently by them, so it kind of gets pushed to the back.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I want to remind our YouTube live stream audience that we are absolutely taking your questions. So if you have a question for anybody you see speaking in front of you, please do drop your question in the chat and we'll get to it. Let's open up first a little bit of audience questions here. We have a question from Adam Collector Records. This person writes, "It's been a hard journey since I joined MusicCoin 3 years ago. Blockchain-based services have managed to only attract independent musicians and hardly any non-musician fans. How do you change that?"
Yeah, so I guess I'm happy to start out if no one else has something that comes to mind. I think the we tried really hard to make sure that the service that we built and the tools that we built are actually providing value to fans as well as artists, right? And when I talked about kind of the value prop for Audius being like connecting fans directly with artists and exclusive new music, the reason that Audius has a lot of exclusive music right now is largely just because artists think, partly it's like they think this is cool. It's like a new crypto thing and whatever. It's also the promise of what's to come in the future, and the opportunity today to build an audience that in the future they would be able to monetize more effectively, manage more effectively, and everything else. So I think it starts with network effects are hard and network effects take time, right? To what Daniel said earlier, when you're choosing to try to build, in our case, like a 3-sided marketplace, right? There are artists, there are fans, and then there are these node operators, and all three of those sides of the marketplace have like a kind of initial hump that you have to get over. It's something that takes time. It takes a lot of energy and in some cases money as well. So I think it's just sort of a kind of a time and a patience thing, but also making sure that along the way you're always providing like a value proposition to all three of those folks, right? Where it's not like, oh, an artist shows up and there are no fans here. Fan shows up, there's no music here. Node operator shows up, they can't make any money here, right? Those are sort of the three humps in our case, like we had to kind of get over to to kind of make this flywheel work. And now we are at a point where we have like enough recurring usage, recurring uploading, and enough node operators that like things do kind of work, right? And we're crossing into that next phase of, how do we scale and grow from here? But I think the kind of wasteland, if you will, of not just blockchain-based music companies, but music companies in general, that precedes what all of us are working on, right, is oftentimes a function of building marketplaces are hard is number one, and number two, there are kind of a lot of like existing powers that be, right, that benefit from the way things are structured today and don't really want that to change, right? So when you put those two things together, you just have to like being decentralized is not a value proposition, right? Like no one cares about that. What people do care about is like what can this thing do for me that like nothing else can do for me right now. And if you can have a compelling answer for that, I think there are opportunities, right? So yeah.
Great. Speaking of new things, we have a question from somebody named Crypto Geek who asks, I think if startups make some mechanism where fans profit from attention and supporting successful songs, it can lead to a game theory that can be scaled. Ultimately, this gets to the question of, sorry, long and winding question. What kinds of innovations on consensus mechanisms and custom blockchains have been invented specifically for the music industry? As we talk about the intersection of music and blockchain, how is blockchain methodology changing, if at all?
I thought, and someone correct me, but I thought, didn't MusicCoin have their own chain that they were working from?
I believe so.
Is that right?
I'm not actually sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. I think one of the challenges, especially for projects that came out in 2016, 2017, and when they were sort of built around these ICO models, was that this idea that would have these dynamically priced tokens and you would get paid in these native tokens, and they would ideally, obviously, if user goes up, then the price of the token goes up. So, all the artists can share in that. But I think what we've seen with a lot of those is obviously the price of those tokens go down. Which obviously, a lot of artists are left sitting there thinking like, well, I've got all this here, and yesterday it was worth $300, and now it's worth $2. So I think that's been one of the friction points in terms of just having this traditionally priced, supply and demand based economic model on token pricing. I think that's introduced a lot of challenges for adoption and even just consistency of performance, really. I'm not too sure on the infrastructure side and specific chains that are being built. I know across in adjacent industries, there's other scaling, layer 2 scaling things being done, like with Loom and gaming. I'm not really aware of of music companies or music projects that are trying to incorporate that technology. Maybe Roneil or Jesse know more about that than me.
I don't think anyone's touched it yet, but I do believe that it's going to get weird. I think, Audius' token is going to come out in a bit. Paperchain's using a token of sorts, I believe, right, with Maker. Collateral. There is some sort of stable thing right there, right?
Yeah. So, we take this data, we create effectively an NFT, and the NFT is like treated like a receivable, and that can be sold to Maker, or it could be sold to anywhere, really.
Right.
One of the interesting things is once Maker or whoever becomes a counterparty to that, is then the ability to then sell that on a secondary market. So you buy this data, you buy this revenue stream from Spotify, but then because it's tokenized, you theoretically could have a secondary market where you could then, if you wanted to cash out now rather than waiting 60 days to get your payment, then you just resell it on a secondary market for a discount. I think that's where it does get interesting, but we're not there yet.
We're not there yet, but that to me is, I think, where the question wanted us to go, is like, how do you start farming music coins and like all of this stuff? And I think that's what we'll start to see probably in the next, 6 to 8 months with this stuff, because, what's going on right now in crypto with yield farming and DeFi is super interesting. It's mostly useless. Besides the gains, there's really not much else there. But the mechanisms, the tools, the economic theories they're testing are going to be pretty instrumental as we move forward with all of this stuff, because I think to that question's point, there are some really interesting game theory things you could do where you start betting on the success of music, you start staking in an artist's success, and not only are you putting your money where your mouth is, but you're then incentivized to go out and promote it, right? And so now you're incentivized to promote for an artist to, be that street team that used to exist 20 years ago that doesn't anymore. And that, to me, I think might be when I start to pop back into music and blockchain, because that stuff's when it gets really fun and interesting. Because I think, if the money could be extracted from speculators, from people betting on success of music, whatever it is, that's where you see a new value chain come in, rather than just from royalties. Because, in the grand scheme of things, it was what, 16 billion a couple of years ago. I don't know what the number is these days, but it's tiny, right? That's that's a third of the market cap of Ethereum. That's a fraction of the market cap of Bitcoin. It's that's a very small amount of money. And we're going to have to start to see, new ways of getting revenue in, because it's not like we're stopping the increasing of people producing music.
Yeah, I think, just before we talked very briefly about Zora and with reverse land, this idea of dynamically priced drops that's happening across, sneakers as was the case. But what's interesting about Zora is it's a USDC run marketplace, but then also when you buy these sneakers, or you buy, I think RAC even has a tape on there. When you buy that, your ownership gets represented by a token, and then you can sell on a secondary market too. So yeah, those are some of the initial gamifications, or at least abilities to create more liquid markets around these type of assets that I've seen, but I haven't seen any projects really going for that. I think was Current, is that still active? I know they did something around rewarding listeners, but again, you struggle when you don't have much catalog to actually get a lot of traction for subscribers and consumers.
Totally.
Yeah, I think where all of this gets so fascinating, right, is to Jesse's point, the composability, right? Like, imagine as an artist, you could now combine your Audius revenue stream, your Paperchain based Spotify revenue stream, all of your revenue streams into like a mechanism that could aggregate those and actually like sell shares in that aggregate combination without getting any permission from us or from Paperchain or from anyone else, right? Which is so cool. Where I really see like kind of musician monetization more generally heading towards is kind of finding ways to engage with and build relationships with those super fans, like the top 5% and top 1% of your fans that are traditionally actually the way that folks would monetize these fans is by doing live events, right? And like, if you're a casual listener of a given artist on Spotify, that's very different from being the person that goes out and buys a $100 ticket to go watch their show, right? Now in the age of coronavirus, I think a lot of that has changed. Now eventually we'll go back to normal there, but I think it's forced everyone in the industry to just really think about how can we monetize digital experiences better, and just digital kind of goods more generally, right? I think it's really interesting to see where a lot of the behavior you see in artists is not that different from what you would see in, say, an early stage software company, right? Like the type of risk that is inherent in that is quite similar, right? Along with the asymmetric upside. And when you really start to understand, what is the business model of a label, it's not that different from like a venture fund, right? They're taking early bets on a different kind of risk. Some people will, there are different ways to frame it, but like, I think for creators and this sort of creative economy more generally that music is part of, in the same way that like more meritocratic and open financing markets have helped startups proliferate to the extent that they have, I think we'll start to see similar things happen in music, right? So the parts of Audius, in the future that we're most excited about are potentially even like not even the things that will be native to our protocol, right? It's like this streaming primitive and these other sets of primitives that folks have put together now allow you to do these higher level things, which I think it's going to be really cool. And to the question, Dylan, that we're all riffing off of right now, I think it actually, like, the earliest solutions in this space, like Mediachain, for example, were their own blockchains because they had no choice, right? There was like you couldn't like build something like this in 2015 without being your own blockchain. Well, Ethereum came out towards the end of that year, but anyway, I think it's kind of a like there's only so much that one company or one group of individuals can try and bite off. So you try and bite off as little as you possibly can and like make something work before you go more broad. And then it becomes a question of like, well, why would it, why is having a music specific chain better than just an open interoperable platform, right? And yeah.
I want to remind all the YouTube audience that we are absolutely answering your questions. Please do drop your questions in the chat. The latest one comes from Rudy Harper, who writes, most of this conversation refers to esoterica that many musicians know they need to track, but cannot devote the time to or may not be technically able to. How do you get around this? If I'm a music person, if I'm a musician, how do I get more tactical about my things like my finances and managing my fans?
I mean, I think, that was the problem we started with in the very beginning. We were like, all right, you know what? Fuck everyone, musicians. That's all we care about. And very quickly we were like sitting there and they were looking at us and they were like, dude, what? Like, I don't know, what are you talking about? MetaMask, why are there 75 steps to sign in? It's like, it created this, like, really, for us, we were like, wow, it's like, there is a lot of value in the music industry, in the people that are there. Managers are still going to be relevant. But instead of managing one artist or two artists really well and having a couple others that they don't manage as well, what if you could manage 10 really well, because you could spend all your time just focusing, working with that artist on a human level and not on a data input level, right? And so to the question, how do you get better at that stuff? I think it's a challenge. I mean, it's, a challenge I think we all go through, not just musicians, of getting all your finances and everything, right, set up properly. So I don't have a good solution there, but I think, consistently what Audius is doing, what Paperchain is doing, it's getting towards being easier. If you can learn about it now, you're a step ahead, you're 2 steps ahead, maybe even 10. Even if you don't totally understand it, you just know it exists. But there will come a time where you sign up, with a username, password, or whatever it is, and you have access to all of that stuff in a dashboard right in front of you. And, I think that's kind of where it's like, how do you tie Paperchain, Audius, what Ujo did, some of these other platforms together, your Spotify, all of this into this, like, beautifully packaged thing. And I think that's the holy grail of what musicians really want. And I think it's going to get there much sooner than we expect, as long as companies are continually staying open, like Paperchain and Audius are doing.
Great.
One of the I guess macro trends that are happening right now is just artists getting a good management team together and they effectively run their own label. So as long as they can get a good marketing team with them, or they'll outsource some elements and do like select deals with maybe a distributor or with a label to handle some elements of the marketing. But it's the artist and manager who are now sitting down and running that as a team, and they're looking at it and effectively running their own business and being very smart about that. In terms of what you have access to now, it depends on which distributor you go through. Most of them should provide some basic analytics. So if you're distributing through them, then you have some insight into where streams are being generated, which streaming platforms are more successful than others. So you kind of have to take that as some sort of analytic or some insight to give you an idea on where the audiences are. And then you combine that with social and where you're interacting with fans on social and where that engagement is coming from, and starting to understand, well, these are where my audiences are. So how do I best monetize those? One of the things we get asked a lot about is particularly from like independent artists, is just about, well, how do I get paid more? And it's unfortunate, it's something that that's something we can't control, because obviously those rates are being set by the streaming platforms, and obviously it's dictated by how many streams you actually generate on those. So I don't think that's going to change. And even on something like Audius, it's about, being able to become more aware of where your audiences exist and how do you engage and monetize them. But you still have that same challenge where that is on you and your management team to actually activate those audiences and be able to turn them into something that can generate some sort of revenue for you. I don't think that will go away regardless of the technology that's available.
Gotcha. We've got about another 10 or 15 minutes remaining. I wonder if we might talk a little bit about this idea of enhanced transparency in the streaming economy. I can't pretend like I know everything about earning a living from Spotify streams, but I do understand that it's very complex and it's very opaque. And something like millions and millions of plays can work out to just be like a few $100 or something like this. So I think there's a big conversation to be had about transparency in the streaming economy. What do these words stir up for you guys?
I think for me and for Audius, I think it's really about understanding how money is coming into the system, being managed by the system, and then distributed out from the system, right? And in all of those steps, there should never be a black box, right? If there is a dispute over like who should be getting paid what, like, say songwriter and artist, or like multiple artists disputing a split or something, there are ways to like escrow those funds until a dispute is resolved, right? So I think there's just some of these things that we talk about, like where money gets trapped in different places and with different things, those things just shouldn't be possible, right? Like if you think about how like a well-designed system would operate, I've heard stories from artists of them getting checks from like, say, the UK Performance Rights Society for like radio plays that happened in the early 2000s, just because it was international, they don't know who they're meant to pay and blah blah blah. It's like it's slowly worked its way through, and then you don't even know, right, as the artist, where that listening was happening. You just get a check and it's like, okay, well, great, I got like $30 from the UK, but like, what does that mean, and where did it come from, and when did it happen, and like all of these things are not super clear. So I think what it means, and this kind of ties back to like the question we just talked about, is like, being a successful, like world scale, whatever you want to call it, artist is only part of that is about like the quality of music you create, right? It's really about like understanding how to find and engage with your fans and building a community of those folks, and like there's so much to it, right? But when you don't even know like where those people are, or how to find them, or how they're finding you, or where you should be playing your show next week because there's a spike in listening from a given place, like all of these things, we just really strongly feel that like, not only should that data be open to the artist, it should be open to like everyone, right? In the world we're in today, actually, like there are certain privileged rights holder groups, for example, that actually get like listening data from Spotify, for example, before like the artists get that data. There are well documented cases even of like effectively like labels signing artists, like understanding how big the artist is before the artist themselves understands how big they are, right? It's almost like front running in like exchange markets. It's happening on much longer timescales in music. So I think transparency doesn't solve all of these things, but when folks are forced to answer for why things are happening, I think you see accountability emerge where it doesn't exist today, right? Because no one knows what's happening. There's no way to hold accountable the sort of the folks who are doing these things, right? So
too big to fail. It's too big to fail.
I think there's there's a couple of flavors to the transparency conversation too. Even like we've had conversations with labels and we show them, well, this is what we can do. We can take the streaming data, we can price it, and you can see how much money is sitting there in the pipeline waiting to get paid out. And their response has been, well, we wouldn't necessarily want to show that to our artists because once they see that the money's there, they're going to want it. And we're like, yeah, that's the whole point, because it's their money, and why shouldn't they have access to it? So that's kind of like how the industry has operated for such a long time. And we don't, when we talk about transparency with labels, we don't necessarily mean all your data and is going to be published on the blockchain or it's going to be made available. It's more just about, this is a tool really for you to have more transparent conversations with artists and artist management teams about, this is the money that's in the pipeline. This is how much is going back to, this is how much will be coming back to recoup your deal. This is how much, if you need $2,000, like there's $2,000 in the pipeline, we can take that right now and invest that back into marketing. Like, it's about enabling those conversations where they can be very honest and open with each other about the current financial position of the artist, which just doesn't happen right now. We've had conversations with majors who have insisted that they wouldn't want to, it wouldn't be good for them to integrate with our system because at the end of the day, they said the artist doesn't even know the terms of their deal. So they're like, we wouldn't give you access to it because we don't even give the artist access to that. So it's kind of like, it's just like the old school operating model that just introduces so much opaqueness, not even on the rates that the streaming platforms pay out, but then that whole business process that it goes through to get to the artist. There's a lot of things that need to be sort of broken down and worked through before we can get to that.
Yeah, and to clarify a thing there too, I mean, I don't think any of us are saying that, like labels don't like deserve what they're getting or anything like that. It really is just that it should be understood by everyone how that's working, right? If an artist wants to enter into in good faith a contract and a decision to give a label the majority of their earnings in exchange for the marketing support and the powerhouse that the label is, like, no harm, no foul, right? That's fine, right? I mean, they're two parties that should be able to make a decision together. It's when the sort of like these larger rights holders that control large catalog have aggregated catalog into a very large thing, they can now effectively collectively bargain in a way that independent folks can't, right? So that's why you see some of those folks getting paid in under very different terms by open streaming platforms, for example, than like smaller individuals do, right? So it's almost I guess at its core, like, blockchains can't solve human problems, right? And I think music as an industry has like a lot of just incentive misalignment issues, right? Like, these are all predictable outcomes when you think about like the incentives of every respective individual, and no one here is behaving maliciously. It's just like, this is what they're incentivized to do, right? And I think that's where transparency and accountability can, to Daniel's point, at least like create the space for these conversations to happen, because right now no one knows what the fuck's going on with anything, right? How cool would it be if like a data scientist could go analyze the data for what streaming is happening or how people are discovering things, and like start to predict which artists are going to break out soon, for example, which like labels actually internally do already, right? But like if that sort of, if those data streams are available to the world, I just think we'll see some really, really interesting unpredictable results come from that.
Very good. Well, guys, we're just about at the top of the hour here, so I want to end on a slightly lighthearted note. We've had a big, heavy conversation about, everything from royalties and money and the music business and everything. I think it'd be fun as a parting shot if each of us shared our favorite album that came out this year, and I'll happily go first. It's The Strokes, The New Abnormal for me. Who else has a favorite that came out this year?
It's so hard to pick one.
I would say probably Dewar Salah, her Rosetta release is probably my favorite so far.
Okay.
I think I really enjoyed RAC's album Boy.
That's not fair, Roneil. I was gonna pick that just to show my friend.
It was a really good album, and it was a really long album too. And you rarely see albums that are like so long be kind of like high quality throughout, right? But I'm sorry, Jesse, I stole.
No, it's cool. It's cool.
Here, I'll find a different one to read.
Nah, Boy is one of my favorite albums of the year for sure. What else came out this year? This year feels like
It's been a weird year, guys.
Yeah.
There's a lot. I mean, there was a new Nas out last week, which is pretty good. But yeah, so it's just.
Oh, I dig it. I didn't know that. I know I lean way more rock than rap, but I still appreciate some good rap. All right. Well, I don't see that much need to dilly dally anymore, guys. Thank you for a very productive conversation. Thank you to our YouTube audience for tuning in and asking great questions. I feel personally that we've only just really scraped the layer of what's going on here. I look forward to doing more events like this in the future.
Excellent. Thanks. Dylan.
Awesome. Thank you for having us.
guys.
Peace be with you.
Later.